In the tapestry of life, where every thread holds a story, America in black and white emerges as a haven for the voices echoing through the heart of our communities. In this podcast, we wade through the rivers of our collective experiences, celebrating the vibrant hues of change brought forth by the whispers of hope and the roars of action. It's more than just a conversation. It's a journey into the heart of our society, illuminated by the light of those daring to dream and do. Join us, and let your voice be the melody that guides us toward a dawn where every color finds its place in the masterpiece of our shared destiny. Together, let's paint a future brimming with the positives that dwell in our minds and the actions that shape our world.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of America in Black and White, where we are coloring conversations on the canvas of America. Tonight, our special guest is Mr. Harold Michael Harvey. Harold is a two-time award-winning author for his memoir, Freaknik Lawyer, a memoir on the craft of resistance, and the historical novel Watch Night. Our souls cried out for freedom, a narrative history of Bethel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, Macon, Georgia, from 1863 to 2023. Harvey is a past president of the oldest Black Bar Association in Georgia and founder of the Gate City Bar Association Hall of Fame. An avid baseball fan, he is a voting member of the National College Baseball Hall of Fame. Harvey is an engaging public speaker. And ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you guys. Welcome Mr. Harold Harvey to the show. Hello, sir.
Hey, how are you today, sir?
I'm doing just excellent. Is there anything you'd like to add to your bio?
Oh, excellent bio. You know, that was succinct and to the point.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for those kind words.
Well, I am just honored to have you here for one thing, because I consider you to be one of those historical figures that's got a lot that our community as well as our youth could learn a thing or two from. And
Well, thank you.
so I'd like to get into your writings here, and if you can tell us what inspired you to write Freaknik Lawyer, a memoir on the craft of resistance.
Um, well, I tell you, I had the year before the pandemic, I believe 2019, a group of podcasters in New York reached out to me and asked if I would be interested in talking to them about the role I played doing Freaknik in the mid 1990s. And
Hmm.
I told them I would. And so we set up an appointment. They came down to Atlanta, came over to the house and set up the recording, asked me various questions. And at the conclusion of the interview, when they were packing up their equipment to go, uh, the podcaster who conducted the interview, just as a parting question or shot, leaving the house, said, "Why did you do it?" And uh, of course, at the time in 1990, I felt it was a need for someone to stand up and represent those defenseless students, but it obviously took a great deal of courage. The initial idea was for the Gate City Bar Association to organize a group of lawyers who would be on the ready to help defend these students as they were arrested. This would have been the first year would have been 1995, and Freaknik um, always occurred on the third weekend in April every year. That was like clockwork. It started in the 1980s as a small gathering and grew to this humongous event that the city of Atlanta wanted to suppress and wanted to discourage students from coming to Atlanta during the third weekend in April. So when the appointed date weekend came, no lawyer showed up but me, and
Oh
so
wow.
I did all the work myself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so at the time, I just thought I was fulfilling an immediate need that needed to be filled. But when I was asked that question at the end of the interview and the guys left, I began to think, well, where did that courage come from? Why, when you realized you were going to be standing out there by yourself, why didn't you just fold too and not participate? Why? Where did that courage to stand up to the mayor of Atlanta and the governor of the state of Georgia um, and all the powers that be? Where did that courage come from? So I started doing some research, and I discovered my grandmother's grandfather standing on a slave auction block in 1847 in Hawkinsville, Georgia. He was chained to his brother. My fourth grandfather would have been 25 at the time, and his brother was 19 or 20 years old at the time. And as the story go, and I learned of them from a newspaper article that was published in a Missouri newspaper in 1888. And the way the reporter, the writer wrote the story, it is said that um, 1,000 um, slaves were taken off of a ship in North Carolina and marched to Hawkinsville to be auctioned off. And they would warehouse these Africans until the auctioneer came to town for the auction. And while in this warehouse, I learned of one particular planter in the area who owned 5 plantations in the middle Georgia area. And this particular planter was very mean to the people he enslaved. And so my relatives had determined that they would not slave on his plantation. And
Mm-hmm.
so when the auction started for these two brothers, this planter began to bid for them. And they told him, Mister, you can keep your money. We don't lack you, and we ain't going to live with you. And he said, well, that's why I have the dogs. So he wins the bid, marches them off to one of his plantations in that middle Georgia area near Hawkinsville. They stay there for 3 days, and they're able to escape and head for the swamps. And this planter sends Africans who handle the dogs for him into the swamp after my relatives. And they find them, bring them out of the swamp, and are walking them back to the plantation. And before they get there, they escape again. And this time, they stay in the swamp for 3 years. So
Mm-hmm.
when 1850 comes around, the planter, not having received the benefit of the money he paid for them, suddenly decided that out of frustration, he was tired of trying to hunt them down to get them back. He sold his rights to them to another planter. Somehow, my relatives received word that they had been sold to another planter. They walked out of the swamp into downtown Hawkinsville, and the news account says that hair covered their face, and the only thing you could see was dark eyes, but that hair was all over their face. And they walked to up to Planter Brown, turned themselves in, and worked on his plantation until the war was ended in 18 that ended slavery in 1865. So when I learned that story, I says, okay, there were some stubborn curses.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they had the courage to stand on the auction block and dare a planter to bid on them and to tell him in no uncertain terms they didn't like him and they wasn't going to live with him.
Mm-hmm.
And so it dawned when I learned. So then it dawned on me that's where I found that courage. So I decided that I would write my memoir, Freaknik Lawyer. Now the title, may I continue?
Yes, because I was
Yeah.
going to ask you about that title.
Okay. Um, so after the first year after Freaknik, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, I had to attend a calendar call in DeKalb County, and um, sometimes the judge comes out on time, and sometimes he's in his chambers uh, discussing privately cases with other lawyers, trying to get issues resolved in other cases, and then they'll come out and they'll handle that calendar for the day. So the judge was delayed in coming out to the bench, and I'm sitting over in the jury box. Lawyers would congregate over in the jury box and sit down, and so I'm sitting next to Hank Johnson, who's the congressman from that area now, but
Mhm.
he was just a practicing attorney like I was at the time. But he was a real funny guy. So he sat there and was cracking jokes. He just cracked me up. And we're just laughing, having a good time, waiting for the judge to come out. And a white lawyer came up and pointed at Hank Johnson, says, "I know you, and I've heard some things about you." And then he looked at me and said, "I know you too. I know I had never met this guy." And so he says, "You're the Freaknik lawyer." Ha 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 ha.
Mhm.
So I didn't take kindly to the nickname. I've never liked nicknames. You
Mhm.
know, call me Harold or call me Michael or call me Harvey,
Mhm.
but don't call me Freaknik lawyer.
Mhm.
That's what he did, and he laughed because he thought it was funny.
Mhm.
Uh, the work that I thought was very serious and helping these black students get
Mhm.
out of jail, their records clean so that they could finish school and get into graduate school and into the various professions that they're probably engaged in right now.
Mhm.
And he wanted to make fun of it. So I didn't like the name. But after I saw the stubbornness in my relatives in 1850, 3 years before the compromise of 1850, the Missouri, and 13 years before the Civil War broke out, 15 years before it was resolved, um, I then became to embrace what I had done in standing up to the powers that be in the last decade of the 20th century.
Mhm.
Could it all come full circle? That's where the title comes from.
Oh, wow. So, how did your upbringing in Macon, Georgia shape your perspective as a writer?
Um, Well, I think my writing probably started before my family moved to Macon. I was born in the Crawford County area, which is about 25, 30 miles west of Macon. My family were farmers. And so I start first grade in the latter part of the 50th century. And I believe when I was in second and third grade, my my teacher had us to write a poem,
Mhm.
and it may have been about a rose or something. I'm not quite sure, but my poem obviously had more depth to it than the poems of the other third graders who were in my class. Um, and so she called my mom to the school and had her take a look at the poem that I had written, and I could see them whispering off to the side. And I knew they were talking about me, and I knew they were talking about the words on that paper, but I didn't understand my expression and
Oh,
how I had expressed myself on that paper. And but what I think they were doing was saying that this was really some fantastic writing, and but we're not going to tell him because we don't want him to think, he's got a lock on this.
mhm.
So I've had in my spirit this ability to write, a desire to express myself through the written form.
Mhm.
Um, fast forward, my life in Macon. I mean, in school, I always liked to write reports. When most kids would frown at having to write a report or a term paper, they would frown upon that. I enjoyed cracking opening the encyclopedia, doing my research, and writing up my report. And to me, that was like easy schoolwork. Math, not so much, but the doing some research and writing about what I had learned through the research was like easy schoolwork for me. And so that's how my skills develop. And now, when I'm in 11th grade, my mother enrolled me in a correspondence writing course. I may
Mhm,
have badgered her for about a year
mhm,
to enroll me into this course. And of course, there wasn't really any extra money
mhm.
for a writing course. And my mom correctly discerned that writers, you couldn't make a living writing. And so, of course, mothers want the best for their sons. So she wanted me to really to latch onto an avocation where I could make money and make a living at doing it. And so she wanted to discourage me, and she just wouldn't didn't see the value of me taking that course. But after about a year of me constantly asking her about it, she finally agreed, and she enrolled me into this course. And I got a book. Um, Always keep it nearby. I can't reach and find it right now, but it was the Elements of Style by Strunk and White, and it
Mhm,
had these little simple rules. The thing that stuck out in my mind about that book was uh, either Strunk or White had this philosophy that a sentence should not contain any unnecessary parts, just like a automobile shouldn't contain any unnecessary parts. And
mhm.
so I learned brevity from the Elements of Style, um, and I continue to hone my skills. Now, my senior paper, I
Mhm.
wrote such an outstanding paper, in my opinion, on Elizabethan Eng- England.
Yes. Oh my
Um,
God.
and because I was an avid reader at that time, I loved Baldwin at that time, and I read Hughes, and I read Richard Wright, County Cullum. I mean, all the guys coming out of the Harlem Renaissance, I had read them. Ralph Ellison, Malcolm X, and one of the things I learned from Baldwin, how Baldwin would always take a phrase from maybe a spiritual and put it in italics before a chapter that
Mhm,
sort of gives you some eye or some clue to what that chapter is about. That after you read that chapter, something you've known and from some gospel or spiritual that you've always known, it just really it brings it full circle and makes more sense out of it. And it also gives sense and context to what that chapter was about.
mhm.
Well, I deployed this technique as a uh, high school senior in my senior term paper. And I used a quote from someone, I think it was a quote from Baldwin. It may have been a quote from The Fire Next Time, um, where where I used the quote, I put it in quotation marks at the beginning quote, period. I left off the end quote.
Mhm,
So the English teacher said that I had plagiarized the paper from that first passage, and she didn't read the rest of the paper. Now I know she read that paper, and that was an A paper because I
mhm,
did the research. I knew Elizabethan English. I knew William Shakespeare. I knew
mhm,
that period, and I really had created a great book. But being an African living in America at that point in time, not really understanding who I was or what my place in America was, but I knew it was special and unique.
mhm.
I sort of put the Elizabethan English through the eyes. I wrote about it through the eyes of an African 17-year-old kid living in America.
Mhm.
And she said she refused to write the paper and it was an F. And it caused my grade in that course, in the English course, senior English, to, I think it brought it down to an F. I had a B going into it, which meant I had to make an A on the remaining 9-week grading period in order to graduate. And
Mhm.
lo and behold, we were reading Lord Jim, we were reading Macbeth, uh, um, we were reading several other of the outstanding English authors of the 18th century. And so I ate it up. The other
Mhm.
kids didn't read that stuff. They were waiting for her to tell them uh, what was going on in the stories. And so when she uh, asked asked for people to volunteer to answer a question, my hand always went up, and you got extra credit for answering the questions. And when she threw the pop quizzes in, because I was reading probably ahead of her, surely ahead of everybody else in the class, the white kids in the class.
Mhm.
Um, I was making A's on all the pop quizzes, and I was getting the 15 and 20 points by a day by raising my hand and being able to discuss, Lord Jim or Macbeth or whatever it is we're reading at that time. And so I think by making an A that pulled my literacy, and I was able to graduate. But that lady would have held me back, not because I couldn't write, but because
Okay.
I wrote so well as a 17-year-old. But I didn't
Mhm.
get that validation as a writer when I was in my early years. Um, but then let's fast forward a few years. I go off to college, and I decided one day that I would write an editorial in the Campus Digest. I attended school at Tuskegee Institute at that time, Tuskegee University today. And in the spring of the year, I got up the courage to submit an editorial to the newspaper, and it went over well. And so the following year, the editor of the publisher of the newspaper asked me if I would write a weekly column in the Campus Digest. And so I titled the column Slowly. And the reason I titled it Slowly was, life is there's a very hectic pace on campus, and
Mhm.
I wanted to slow my classmates down and have them to really stop and think about the issues of the day. And so I think that's really where I honed my writing skills by being able to write those weekly columns at Tuskegee and to have the campus to respond to those articles. And people will walk up to me and say, "Well, I finally understand that issue after having read your column for a couple of weeks," or you made that plain. I see what's going on now. So I think that's how I developed and matured as a writer.
So let me ask you a follow up question because it's really interesting that you did your term paper in high school and during the Elizabethan period. And I just want to ask you some comparison and your thoughts. Um, I actually, when I was in high school, we actually had the same period that we had to write our term paper on. I did mine on Samuel Johnson, which
Wow.
was I thought that Samuel Johnson was a much better writer than William Shakespeare. He just didn't get the credit because Shakespeare was so creative in the way he did things that he did. My question to you is as you think back to that period, do you really think William Shakespeare was the best writer of that period?
Um, we didn't spend a great deal of time on Samuel Johnson, although my teacher, although she tried to fail me, I think she was very steeped in English and
Hmm.
in British literature. And she thought, as she called him, Willie Shakespeare. She thought that Willie Shakespeare was the best writer of that time period. And although we talked about Johnson, she didn't spend that much time on him. And so my my interest or research in Johnson was not as deep as it was in Shakespeare. But I think Johnson was probably Johnson touched on issues that the average um, Brit was interested in at that time, or at least their life. Whereas Shakespeare t- t- talked about um, the problems and the missteps of primarily people in the ruling class.
Hmm.
And but you get your political commentary through Samuel Johnson.
Yes.
So I mean, it's just a matter of degree of what interests you about that period, whether the social climate or the aristocracy and the rise and fall of kings and queens and princes and so forth. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
So, no, I'm just assuming then that you agree that Shakespeare is probably the best writer of that period.
I think so. I mean, he wrote the King James version of the Bible, and it took me. Kids had a hard time with Macbeth, and I'm
Yeah.
saying, hey, in the third grade, I was reading King James version of the Bible. So I've been
Wow.
reading King James since the third grade. So
Right.
when I got to Willie Shakespeare, it was easy. Because that was the language of the old King James version of the Bible that I had grown up on. And somebody in the house, my mom or grandmom, stuck a little King, the New Testament, the King James version in my hands, and
Hmm.
so I was familiar with the language. Those words rolled off the tongue, and I could understand what Shakespeare was writing about.
Now, I will tell you, now, because you can't really find much of Samuel Johnson's writings, but I have a lot of what Shakespeare has written. I have to say that I have a lot of what he wrote, and I will say that the creativity that comes from what he did, what he was writing and what he was doing as far as like the arts and so forth. I mean, it's very much so like it was futuristic that it's so like what we can talk about today, because
Mhm.
and knowing that you got women playing the roles of men and men playing the roles of women and just doing all of that good stuff. That kind of creativity was really, really something that I know is what pulled people in. That got him that notoriety. And I gotta
Yeah,
say that it was pretty good. It really was.
yeah. I mean, I enjoy. It's the metaphors, I think,
Mhm.
that really captured my attention. The cleverness and um, the way he phrased things, and you just took me back to Miss Early again because clever was one of her words.
Oh, really?
Yes. Uh,
Everything's about being
so
clever.
I guess she played a part in my life after all, right? But
Yeah,
the
exactly.
interesting thing about her. So I had a case in the late 1980s in Bibb County, and so I was back home, and I ran into a guy who was in my class my senior year, and
Mhm.
I hadn't seen him in a number of years. He says, "Well, I live two doors up from Miss Early, and I actually look. She's getting old now, but I actually look after her and her sister. I make sure they get to their doctor's appointments, and if she needs me to go down to get her prescriptions from the drugstore and so forth." He said, "Would you like to go by and see her?" I said, "Yeah, sure would." So he took me by, and I walk in, and she says, "Harold Harvey, I knew you were going to be a success." And I was glad to see her. But I'm thinking to myself, yeah, you did everything you could to make me fail,
Yep.
not wanting to
Um,
acknowledge that I was as good at this as I as as I have become. So the guy who was accused of having plagiarized a senior paper is now a two-time award-winning author.
oh wow.
Go
See.
figure.
So, can you tell us what historical significance does Bethel CME Church hold in your novel Watch Night?
Okay, well, um, that's where I grew up. That's church
Okay.
for me. That's my home church. When we moved to Macon, Georgia in 1960, and now we're in the city, and we're at Bethel. So coming of age in Bethel, and it holds a significant interest for me, primarily because when you go back to 1863, that church was founded January the 1st, 1863.
Hmm.
And can you imagine why they met on January the 1st, 1863?
No.
Well, in September of 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued what became known as the Emancipation Proclamation
Oh, okay.
on September the 27th. And he says that that proclamation would take effect on January the 1st, 1863. And in that proclamation, he told the nation that he was going to liberate all people in slavery that were enslaved in states that had been liberated by Union forces. So that evening of that New Year's evening, black people in Macon, the Methodists, there were a group of Methodists and Baptists and a few Presbyterians who would periodically, I mean regularly, not periodically, regularly meet on the banks of the Upmogi River to hold church services. Now
Hmm.
on Sundays they were required to go to worship with their enslaver. They would stand in the balcony or sit in the balcony um, while their enslavers were out were conducting their services um, in the main sanctuary. And but they would steal away at night, and they would meet on the banks of the Gulf out in the open and hold their prayer services, their services as the Spirit led them to conduct worship. But this night, they were afraid. This New Year's night, they were afraid to worship on the banks of the Ogie for fear that the enslavers would come and would rather see them dead than see them free.
Mm.
So they found a white frame house in what was known as Central City Park then. It now has a new name, named after some contemporary person who lived during my lifetime. And Carolyn Creighton Park is what it's now called. And so they met there, and they sang songs and they prayed and they stayed awake, watched. They watched all night. So all over the country, particularly in the South, churches have watch night services, and that's what other enslaved people did in these other areas of the country. There are a number of churches that started on that night because
Mm.
the people came together fearing what would happen when the sun came up. And so
Mm.
when the sun came up on January 1st, 1863, the folks looked out the door window and they discovered nobody came for them. There was no night riders out there. And really, life hadn't changed any, a one iota from what it was the day before because the Union troops were so far away in 1863 from Georgia. So that's one thing. The history of its founding is one of the things that inspires me so much about this place. Is that It was founded by these people who
Mhm.
were afraid of what would happen when the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. Now, there are, I have identified three families that are still in that church today whose descendants worshiped that night on January 1st, 1863. And that was
Oh
the
wow.
fourth. But this lady, Miss Battle, died, I think, in the early 2000s, and she didn't marry. And I don't know that she has any relatives. At least there were no other Battle attending Bethel during my time there from the 1960s on up until till now. Um, but there are three that still have members who come to that church who worship, who descendants at least worship that first night of Washington 1863. So that's what really draws me into where my parents took me to worship.
So, what challenges did you face while writing Watch Night, and how did you overcome them?
Well, a big volume of research. Okay. Um, the history of the church. Well, I'll put it this way. I don't know if I really had any difficult challenges for this reason. Um, when the we my elementary school principal, her name was May Miller, and Mrs. Miller, after she graduated college, I think she went to Fort Valley State. After she finished college, she then in the 19 late 2030s began to go around conducting oral histories from people who were alive in 1863 who were members
Oh,
of that church.
oh wow.
So Ms. Miller had she had the reels of recorded history. I couldn't get my hands on the reels, but there was a written summation of the history, of the oral history that Ms. Miller had gathered in the 20s and the 30s. And so there were still some people who were aged at the time who attended the church on January 1st, 1863. And then there were some younger children um, who were there. And then you had descendants, you know, second generation descendants of people who were members of the church who remember the oral history that their relatives had taught them. And so she had gathered much of this history and had it written down. Um, Growing up on church anniversary day, Mrs. Miller would always get up and recite a portion of the history. Okay, so I grew up hearing the history at least repeated once a year. And Mrs. Miller had a mentee, a young woman who taught me in elementary school also, um, who she then passed this history on, and I dedicated the book to both Mrs. Miller and Mrs. Willering Sanders because when Mrs. Miller began to age, then she passed her work on to Mrs. Sanders, and Mrs. Sanders becomes now the church historian, and she would on church anniversary day get up and recite the history that had been collected by Mrs. Miller. Well, one, I believe it was 2014, my mother was asked to talk about why it was necessary to have a church anniversary. And so she called on son number two and said, "Son, help me write a speech."
Okay. Wow.
So now I gather this volume of information from Mrs. Miller and Mrs. Sanders, Miss Sanders. She never married, and I helped my mom to write a. And what I did is I actually expanded um, the history that Miller and Saunders had, and I brought it up to date, up to 2015, 14. Um, in previous years, up to 2014, they were able to actually print the history in the bulletin that was presented for that printed for that program that Sunday. But because I had expanded it, it was too large. And so the pastor at the time suggested that maybe you should do a book. So, so I had that history, but now what I wanted to do in order to give context to Bethel CME Church is I wanted to understand the broader context of the history that produced this church. So this church comes out of the period of enslavement and this period of emancipation. And so then I began to layer the personal story, oral history of the people who were around uh, when the church was formed,
Mhm.
and I began to layer it with the history of the country
Mhm.
and who we were or how we were perceived by the larger society as we are coming together to form this worship center that has stood the test of time since 1863.
Mhm.
It met last Sunday.
Oh wow.
So it continues to meet. Um, and I still call it my church home. I get in the car and drive down to Macon to church on Sundays um, when I don't have if I'm not on the road traveling doing something. That is where I go to church. So that was the big challenge was to be able to put Bethel not just as a church, but what is the historical context that we find this church that sits on the hill of the Unionville community in Macon, Georgia. And it's a fascinating history. So I grew up hearing the elders talk about, well, we started out in a bush arbor. Well, when the whites wanted to move them out of that white frame house, they then found, well, let me go back. Let me tell you this. This is an interesting story about this church because there was Methodists and Baptists who met in that house on January the 1st, 1863. Okay. So there came a time when the whites wanted to move them out of that area because Central City Park holds one of the oldest minor league baseball parks in the country still today. Luther Williams baseball field, William Luther's field, uh,
Okay.
is in that park. I played baseball in that park growing up as a kid. The movie Bingo Long and his Traveling All Stars, starring Richard Pryor, James Earl Jones, Billy D. Williams. Um, that movie was filmed there. You can find me in a little small cameo playing baseball against the Traveling All Stars in that movie. Um, and so they wanted to move them out because on Sunday afternoons, the crowds come in and watch the white guys play baseball. So a guy owning a lumber company in the area came to the church and told the two different congregations, the Baptist and the Methodist, that I've got some property in West Bibb County, and I'll give that property to the first denomination that can get a load of lumber on the property. Well, the Baptist group got the lumber on the property first, so he deeded them the property. They built their church. But now we've got to get out of the house. We go down on the corner of that property on one side of it, and we build a bush arbor, and we would hold. our services under that bush arbor that kept the sun and the rain and the wind out. And eventually, we were able on the move to the next corner of that same lot in the park and actually built a wooden edifice where they began to worship. And they worshiped there until 1902, I think. Um, and the church burned. Now, let me tell you
Ooh.
something. Even way back in 1902, black churches don't just burn in a vacuum.
I'm sorry, but I understand what you're saying.
It just doesn't happen. So
Right.
they burned. So they
Exactly.
were burned out, and they found some the Methodist Church South people at the Mulberry, what is now the Mulberry United Methodist Church, but at that time it was the Mulberry Methodist Episcopal Church, Methodist Church. They were under the umbrella of the Methodist Church South. See, the Methodist Church split over slavery in 1863, and you had the Methodist Church North and the Methodist Church South. And in 1963, the
Mhm.
two branches merged again and became known as the United Methodist Church. So if you ever want to know where the United
Mhm.
Methodist Church came from, that's its origin. Okay,
Mhm.
so they helped us to acquire some property out in West Bell County, inside the city limits. The church that the Baptist built was outside of the city limits,
Mhm.
and so we stayed there until one Sunday morning in 1946. Willering Sanders was like a 9-year-old girl. The historian I told you about earlier.
Mhm.
Willering Sanders was a 9-year-old girl, 8 or 9 years old. One Sunday morning, she discovered that the church was on fire, and she yelled for Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Miller and the pastor got everybody out of the church, and Mrs. Miller played the organ, and she played the organ in order to help spirit the members out of the church. And after the last person got up, she got up from her seat and rushed out of the building. So that
Mm.
church again was burned.
Wow.
While they're discovering now, while they're trying to figure out how they're going to acquire land somewhere. Well, no, not acquire land somewhere because they own that property. How they're going to build a new church? Um, the Bibb County School Board comes and says, "Hey, you know, we've got some property down the street, about a half mile down the street from here. We'll swap that property to you for this property, and you can build a church down there."
Mm.
And so the board came in and built Winship Elementary School on the property where our church was. But guess when we moved down the street, guess who our church is within 100 yards of, maybe 50 yards of?
Oh.
The Baptist church that we originally
Oh.
worshiped with in the
And you
white
moved
frame
away from.
house. We come all the way full circle.
Wow.
And so until 1984 or 5, um, that church was called Unionville Baptist Church, and we were at the time Bethel Colored Methodist. And well, no, yeah, we no, I think the name had been changed by then to Christian Methodist as opposed to Colored Methodist. We started out as a Colored Methodist, and so in '84 or 5, the Baptist group moved to a location out in South Macon, but from about 52 to 84, those churches were side by side, reunited again, and every Christmas and Easter sunrise, so they would hold a sunrise service on Christmas and Easter, and we would change pulpits. I mean, if our our congregation would go to them on Easter, and they would come to us on Christmas, and vice versa. We would swap up every year and rotate like that. They did that even did it after the church moved out in South Macon for a short while, and then the Baptists got a preacher who didn't know the tradition, and didn't, because they had no connection. They were so far away from us at that point, and they didn't have any, didn't understand the history of those two churches. Most people I've talked to, my people that I grew up with who were in that church, who didn't know that we all initially came out of the same body. So yeah, that's how the history of that church.
So, can you tell us why did you feel it was important to establish the Gate City Bar Association Hall of Fame?
I was surprised actually by 1995 that we didn't have one. And, the association was founded in 1947,
Hmm.
by a guy from, one of the movers was a guy who grew up in the Macon Fort Valley area, um, served as an officer in the First World War, came back home from the war with his law degree, and attempted to practice law in Macon, and had to represent his client standing outside of the well. Couldn't go inside the well like the white attorneys. He had to stand outside and represent his client. And so he decided he would move to Atlanta. That was Mr. Walden. And when Attorney Walden came to Atlanta, lo and behold, he discovered there's about 5 or 6 lawyers, black lawyers here.
Oh,
And so
wow.
then they began to talk about the need to form an association. They couldn't belong to the Atlanta Bar Association. So they formed their own bar association. And, back in that day, they would, it was sort of like having a law practice, because at their meetings, what they would do is one guy would come and says, I've got this case coming up next week. It's a criminal case or it's a real estate case. And they would then try the case. They would go through the point, counterpoint, raise all the objections, and yeah, and it would help the guy to figure out the objections that was going to come and what they needed and how he was going to overcome those objections. And so they helped each other in their practices. And so when I come along and as the president, I discovered there wasn't one, and I says, it's the it's it was at that time the only black bar association in the state. And so I put forth the idea. My board resisted it, but that stubbornness of Dipsy Clark came out of me, and I insisted were going to do it. So in February, I think it was February the 21st, 1996,
Hmm.
we held um, a Gate City Bar Association gala, and where a Hall of Fame dinner, and where we inducted all of the original members of the Gate City Bar Association. And I'm thinking R.E. Thomas, I believe, was the only of the original members alive at the time. And R.E. Thomas is actually the member that named the association. When
Okay.
they met to form the group, and they were trying to figure out a name for the group, RE had a case up in Marietta, and so he arrived at the meeting late, and they had everything worked out, just didn't know what to name it. And he said, "We're the Gateway. Why not the
But
Gate City Bar?" Yes, why not the Gate City Bar Association? So that's how. So Thomas named the group. He was still alive at the time, but we posthumously inducted all of the other original members, and we gave a lifetime achievement award to Donnelly Hollowell, um, who Donnelly was a Buffalo Soldier,
mhm.
um, and had served the military in the Ninth Cavalry. Came here, got married, and had quite a practice. And when Jimmy Carter was elected president, I think Carter appointed him to be in charge of the some federal agency, and I'm sorry that the name of the organization, the federal agency that he headed up in it was a regional post that he had. I can't now. off the top of my head say what that name of that agency was or is. But yeah, so that's how that came about. And nobody
So
had done
nobody had done that before.
nobody had done it. So I thought about it, put did the work to make it happen.
So can you tell us what does you being a voting member of the National College Baseball Hall of Fame entail?
Um, well, I tell you, initially I was brought on back in 2011 ish, I believe, um, to help the National College Baseball Hall of Fame um, identify uh, players who had played at HBCUs between the years of like 1885 and at that time 19 up to 1975, and that was a period of time when stats, if they were kept um, contemporaneously with the games being played all those years, they had been lost to time. And so I was tasked with having to develop a list of people and recommendation of people to go into the Hall of Fame. And that is still my role on the Pioneers Committee to help identify players at Black colleges. Now we extended the deadline from 1975 up to 2003 or 2005. So more players in Black colleges are getting into the Hall. And because of my role on the Pioneers Committee, I actually also get to vote on all players to go into the Baseball Hall of Fame. So there are two ballots or two classifications. There is an election for players at primarily uh, white institutions, who have a record, a recorded history of wins and losses, batting average and home runs, runs batted in, and stolen bases and so forth, that you can actually look to and say that, this guy ought to be in because of these are the numbers he put up. It's a little bit different with guys in the black colleges from the 1880s up to now up to 1975 for sure, because there wasn't that the record keeping wasn't as good, and some of those records were even lost if they hadn't been kept, contemporaneously with the games being played. So that's basically what I do for that organization. I really enjoy that work. I enjoy baseball. I love baseball. Baseball is my life. I think life is a game of baseball.
Now, now I'm going to ask this question. I mean, it's kind of like it's a little bit it's what we're talking about, but it's going to be a little bit different because as I think about that work that you do, which is very very important because there's several players that have done have surpassed like numerous of folk that have gotten credits for doing so many things, but you don't know because they're black. But what I want to ask you about is when you think about just baseball in general, and I like to highlight those folk that came from my hometown because I got to say, between Hank Aaron and Satchel Paige, for the way that they played baseball and the things that they done. Now we know Hank Aaron got that home run record, and we know the scarcity, why they were scared about that, and so forth. But how do you think, or why do you think um, it took so long for Satchel Paige to even get into the Hall of Fame when Satchel Paige was the most dominant pitcher? Don't care if he was black, white, Puerto Rican, or Jew. He was the man.
You froze. Can you hear me? Because you froze on the screen.
No more advanced early vote.